Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll travel back to Tudor England and learn about the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. As you relax and get ready for sleep, we'll tell the stories of these 6 women who lived through love, power, and great challenges. Before we begin, take a moment to think about how much life has changed since their time. The stories of these queens are not just tales of crowns and court intrigue, but of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. I hope this story will not only help you learn, but also bring you some peace as you fall asleep. Please also consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, but only if you truly enjoy it, and comment where you are listening from and which time it is there. Enough talk from me. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and enjoy today's video. Imagine yourself sinking into the softest featherbed as candlelight flickers against stone walls and the distant sound of lute music drifts through drafty corridors. Welcome to Tudor England, where we're about to embark on perhaps history's most dramatic marital saga. Are you comfortable? Good, because Henry VIII certainly made sure he was, in his royal four-poster bed, cycling through wives like most people change their linens. You find yourself in the year 1509, where a handsome, athletic young king has just ascended to the English throne. Not the portly, leg-ulcered tyrant of later portraits, no. This Henry is tall, broad-shouldered, with auburn hair catching the light as he moves through Westminster's Great Hall. The air smells of beeswax candles, roasted meats, and the subtle perfumes of courtiers who bathe perhaps once a month, if they're particularly hygienic. The young king's eyes sparkle with promise, not yet shadowed by the disappointments and rage that will come. "I shall have sons," you can almost hear him whisper as his gaze falls upon his first bride. "Strong Tudor princes to secure my dynasty." Oh, sweet summer, chilled if only you knew the tangled path ahead. Catherine of Aragon stands nearby, her Spanish dignity wrapped around her like the finest Castilian silk. At 23, she's actually older than her 18-year-old husband, and carries herself with the quiet confidence of someone who has already weathered storms. Because you see, she's already been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who inconveniently died just 5 months after their wedding. Nothing complicates a royal marriage quite like having previously been your husband's sister-in-law. You might wonder how that even worked in an age of strict religious doctrine. Well, Catherine swore quite firmly, repeatedly, and with impressive conviction that her first marriage was never consummated, making her eligible to marry the spare heir who became King Henry VIII. The Pope himself granted a special dispensation for their union on June 11, 1509, because nothing says complicated relationship status quite like needing papal approval. As you follow the rustle of Catherine's embroidered gown through torchlit corridors, you notice how courtiers bow deeply in her presence. The daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, the same ones who sponsored Columbus, carries the blood of Europe's most powerful dynasty in her veins. Henry didn't just marry for love. He married a valuable diplomatic alliance wrapped in Spanish brocade. Their wedding night unfolds in a chamber hung with the finest tapestries, the bed curtains drawn against the English chill. You can almost hear the whispered prayers of an entire kingdom, hoping for the quick conception of a son. The Tudor dynasty, barely a generation old, needed male heirs like gardens need rain, Without them, civil war could bloom again as easily as spring flowers. Catherine soon conceived, much to everyone's relief. The court held its collective breath which, given Tudor hygiene, was probably a welcome respiratory break. But when January 1510 arrived, she delivered a stillborn daughter. Never mind, you can imagine the courtiers murmuring behind cupped hands, "She'll have a son next time." A year later, she gave birth to a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall. For 52 blissful days, the king had his heir. Imagine the celebrations, fountains flowing with wine, jousting tournaments where Henry displayed his athletic prowess, bonfires lighting the London sky. And then imagine the devastating silence when the infant prince stopped breathing. The timeline of Tudor tragedy rarely allowed for extended happiness. Another pregnancy, another loss, then another. The pattern continued with the grim predictability of English reign. In 1516, Catherine finally produced a living child, healthy daughter named Mary. Henry celebrated. Of course, he wasn't completely heartless. Not yet, but you can sense his disappointment hovering in the air like wood smoke. A daughter wasn't a son, and Tudor inheritance didn't favor girls with crowns. As you drift alongside Catherine through the years, you see her praying with increasing desperation, her Spanish rosary beads clicking softly through fingers, growing more slender as her hopes diminish. By 1518, after yet another failed pregnancy, the once robust queen was approaching her mid-30s, ancient by Tudor standards. Her childbearing days drawing to a close, her regal posture beginning to bend under the weight of royal disappointment. Henry, meanwhile, remained as subtle as a peacock in a chicken coop. His eyes, once devoted to his Spanish bride, began to wander across the court like a child in a sweetmeat shop. The king, who wrote love sonnets and signed letters to Catherine as Sir Loyal Heart, was developing a wandering heart condition that would eventually reach epidemic proportions. You might notice, if you're still awake, are you still with me? Good how Catherine's ladies-in-waiting became increasingly attractive as the queen's fertility waned. One particular lady caught Henry's roving eye, Mary Boleyn, sister to the woman who would eventually cost Catherine everything. But that's getting ahead of our story, and good bedtime tales, like good marriages, shouldn't rush. By 1525, as Henry approached his mid-30s, he had no legitimate son, a wife past childbearing age, and the patience of a toddler denied sweets. The king, who had once defended the Catholic faith against Martin Luther, was beginning to wonder if perhaps God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Theological convenience works wonders when one's desires change. Catherine, wrapped in dignity and prayer books, likely sensed the shifting winds. Court whispers grew louder than the crackling hearth fires. A dark-eyed lady with ambition as sharp as her wit had caught the king's attention. And unlike her sister Mary before her, Anne Boleyn wasn't going to settle for being merely a royal mistress. As you rest your head against the softest pillow, imagine Catherine doing the same, perhaps wondering how 20 years of loyal marriage could dissolve as quickly as morning mist. The Spanish princess who crossed seas to become England's queen would soon face her greatest storm, one that would reshape a kingdom, break with Rome, and send religious tremors across Europe. But for now, let her sleep in peace, unaware that her husband's roving eye has fixed on a lady who would change everything. Let's drift gently into the year 1526, the English court swirling around you like silk ribbons in a summer breeze. You'd think, with all that brocade and velvet, someone might have opened a window, but Tudor England hadn't quite embraced the radical concept of fresh air. The perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to noble noses tell their own aromatic story. Anne Boleyn moves through this fragrant tableau like a shadow with purpose. Recently returned from the sophisticated French court, she carries herself differently than the other lady's chin, slightly higher, dark eyes observing everything while revealing nothing. Her gowns are French in style, her manner continental, her ambition unmistakably English. "I am not my sister," you might imagine her whispering to her reflection as she arranges her dark hair beneath a French hood. Mary Boleyn had warmed the king's bed and received little for it but court whispers and a hasty marriage. Anne had watched and learned that giving Henry everything meant receiving nothing in return. You can almost hear the rustle of Anne's skirts as she maneuvers through the chess game of court politics. Henry's letters pursue her. 16 of them survive to this day, a collection of royal longing penned in his own hand. "I am yours, heart, body, and soul," writes the king who once pledged himself to Catherine. Tudor royal promises, it seems, had the staying power of morning dew. What made Anne so irresistible? It wasn't conventional beauty. Contemporaries described her as striking rather than beautiful, with her long neck, olive complexion, and those remarkable dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Some whispered about a sixth finger or a mole, but likely these were later inventions by those who wanted to paint her as witch-like. No, Anne's true sorcery lay in her sharp intelligence, musical talent, and that rarest of aphrodisiacs. She said no to a king, accustomed to hearing only yes. "I will be your wife or nothing," was her position, delivered with a curtsy perfect enough to respect his station, while her eyes conveyed unshakable resolve. Henry, who had collected mistresses as enthusiastically as he collected fine weaponry, found himself checkmated by a lady-in-waiting. By 1527, as you drift through palace corridors alongside gossiping courtiers, you'd hear an unprecedented phrase, "the king's great matter." Henry, costume changing from devoted husband to tortured conscience, began seeking an annulment from Catherine. The grounds? That very papal dispensation that had allowed him to marry his brother's widow was, he now claimed, invalid all along. Theological convenience is so useful when one wishes to trade in one's spouse for a newer model. Poor Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's Lord Chancellor, a man who had risen from butcher's son to second most powerful person in England, found himself tasked with the impossible, convincing Pope Clement VII to invalidate a perfectly valid marriage. The Pope, unfortunately for Henry's libido, was currently a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Family loyalty proved inconveniently strong. Catherine, meanwhile, refused to go quietly into that good nunnery. When summoned to appear before ecclesiastical courts at Blackfriars in May 1529, you might have seen her enter with regal bearing, drop to her knees before Henry, and deliver a speech that would have won standing ovations in any modern courtroom. "Sir," she said to the king who wished to discard her, "I beseech you for all the love that has been between us, Let me have justice." She reminded him that she came as a virgin to his bed, had been a true and humble wife for over 20 years, and asked what fault she had committed to deserve abandonment. Then, in a dramatic exit that reality television producers would envy, she refused to return to the proceedings, effectively denying their legitimacy. Henry, not known for handling rejection gracefully, responded by separating Catherine from their daughter Mary and exiling her to a series of damp, uncomfortable castles progressively further from court. Tudor heating being what it was, this was tantamount to sentencing her to a life of perpetual colds and rheumatism. By 1531, Anne had been elevated to Marquess of Pembroke, first time a woman had been given a noble title in her own right in England. You can picture her dressed in crimson velvet and ermine at her investiture, probably suppressing a smile at how far the butcher's daughter from Kent had risen. Henry showered her with jewels, properties, and influence, while Catherine shivered in distant castles, clinging to her title as his true wife and queen. Cardinal Wolsey, having failed to secure the annulment, fell from power faster than rain from English skies. He avoided the executioner's axe only by conveniently dying on his way to face treason charges in November 1530. "Had I but served God as diligently as I have served the king," he reportedly said, "he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." Career advice from beyond the grave, courtesy of Tudor politics. Thomas Cromwell rose in Wolsey's place, a man with the pragmatic approach of suggesting Henry make himself head of the church in England, thereby eliminating the need for papal approval altogether. This solution breaking, with 1,000 years of Catholic tradition, appealed to Henry's growing sense that kings should not be constrained by priests, especially foreign ones who wouldn't grant divorces. By January 1533, as frost patterns etched Tudor window glass, Anne whispered momentous news into Henry's eager ear. She was pregnant. The king, who had waited decades for a legitimate son, couldn't wait any longer. On January 25th, he secretly married Anne, while still technically married to Catherine, a bit of marital multitasking that would raise eyebrows even in our modern era. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, recently appointed and thoroughly sympathetic to reform, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void and his marriage to Anne valid on May 23, 1533. 5 days later, he declared Anne the rightful Queen of England. She was crowned on June 1 in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, her dark hair flowing loose beneath her crown as a symbol of virginity. Tudor irony at its finest. As summer ripened Anne's pregnancy, hopes for a prince grew alongside her belly. Astrologers predicted a boy, nurseries were painted in masculine colors, jousts were planned to celebrate the birth of Henry's heir. On September 7, 1533, Anne delivered a healthy child after a difficult labor. The court held its breath. The jousting tournament was quietly canceled. The child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Henry, hiding his disappointment behind a royal mask, assured everyone that sons would follow. Anne, exhausted from childbirth and perhaps sensing the precariousness of her position, smiled bravely at her red-haired daughter. Neither could have imagined that this disappointing girl would one day become England's most celebrated monarch. Catherine, now styled Princess Dowager of Wales, and forbidden to use her royal title, received the news in her exile. You might picture her praying for the infant Elizabeth, even as she maintained she was still the only true queen. Spanish pride and religious conviction were made of stern stuff indeed. As you drift towards sleep in your considerably more comfortable modern bed, imagine Anne Boleyn in her royal chambers, a crown won but not secure, a husband already showing signs of the restlessness that brought her to power. Her dark eyes might have stared into the flames of her bedroom fire, wondering if she had climbed too high, too quickly. For in Tudor England, the higher one climbed, the harder one could fall. And the executioner's axe was always kept sharp, just in case. But that story awaits another night, as your eyes grow heavy and Tudor plots fade into dreams. Rest easy, knowing that whatever marital troubles you might have, at least beheading isn't on the table as a divorce option. Small comforts in our modern world, indeed. Comfortable? Good. Let's tiptoe back into the Tudor court, where Anne Boleyn's story continues to unfold like silk sheets rustling in candlelight. Are you still awake? Perfect, because what happens next would keep anyone from sleeping. The year is 1534, and Catherine of Aragon languishes in damp exile at Kimbolton Castle, stubbornly refusing to accept her demotion from queen to princess dowager. Anne Boleyn, meanwhile, reigns in silks and jewels, navigating court politics with the precision of a master fencer. But her once secure position is developing hairline cracks, fine as those in aging Tudor porcelain. Imagine yourself walking alongside Anne as she processes through Greenwich Palace, courtiers bowing some deeply, others barely inclining their heads. The whispers follow her like the train of her gown. The king's ardor cools. She promised sons but delivered only a daughter. Did you hear about her argument with the king? Anne's sharp tongue, once so fascinating to Henry during their courtship, had become a liability once she wore his crown. I have been waiting long, and might have waited longer still, she reportedly snapped during one disagreement, referring to their 7-year path to marriage. The king who demolished a church to marry her did not appreciate reminders of his impatience. In January 1536, a piece of news traveled through court faster than plague through London. Catherine of Aragon had died at Kimbolton Castle on January 7th. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath among the courtiers. The obstacle to Henry's marriage with Anne was gone, but so was his convenient excuse if he wanted to rid himself of his second wife. Anne, clad in yellow instead of the traditional mourning black, celebrated Catherine's death with notably poor timing. "Now I am indeed queen," she reportedly said, perhaps forgetting that Henry's affections were as changeable as English weather. The king who had moved heaven and earth to marry her was already casting appreciative glances at a demure lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. The very same month that Catherine died, Anne suffered a devastating miscarriage. Not just any miscarriage, but one of a male fetus, approximately 15 weeks along a son who would have secured her position forever. As you stand invisibly by her bedside, you might see the fear dawning in her dark eyes, mingling with grief. She had lost a child, and, quite possibly, her future. Henry, never one for subtlety, reportedly told Anne that he would have no more boys by her. Tudor bedside manner left something to be desired. He blamed the miscarriage on Anne's distress over his jousting accident, but court gossips pointed to his increasingly obvious interest in Jane Seymour. Nothing strains a marriage quite like a husband openly courting your replacement. By April 1536, the atmosphere around Anne had grown so toxic you could almost taste it like smoke from damp Tudor chimneys. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, had become her enemy. Her faction at court was weakening, while the conservative faction that had supported Catherine found new life in supporting Jane Seymour. Politics and pillow talk make dangerous bedfellows. On April 30, 1536, a musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and, under questionable circumstances, likely torture, confessed to being Anne's lover. Within days, 4 other men were arrested on similar charges, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. You might wish to whisper warnings to Anne as she watches May Day celebrations at Greenwich, unaware that the trap was already sprung. On May 2, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London through the same gate she had entered for her coronation just 3 years earlier. "O Lord, help me, as I am guiltless of that whereof I am accused," she reportedly said upon entering. The stone walls that had welcomed her as a queen now imprisoned her as a traitor. The charges against Anne were as numerous as they were outlandish. Adultery, with 5 men, including her brother, plotting the king's death and bewitching Henry into marriage in the first place. The timing was suspiciously convenient for a king who had already identified his next wife. Tudor divorce proceedings had evolved from lengthy papal negotiations to swift accusations of treason. Anne's trial on May 15, 1536, was a masterclass in judicial theater. As you hover unseen among the spectators, you'd notice how the outcome seemed predetermined, the evidence flimsy at best. Not a single person spoke in her defense. The men accused with her had already been convicted. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, delivered the sentence: death by beheading or burning, at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a gesture that historians still debate was mercy or merely efficiency, commuted her sentence to beheading by sword rather than axe. He even imported a swordsman from France, perhaps the only time in history that hiring a foreign executioner could be considered a thoughtful gesture. In the early morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to a scaffold erected on the Tower Green. The woman who had changed the course of English history would have her own dramatically altered by a single sword stroke. Dressed in dark gray with a red petticoat, she addressed the assembled crowd with remarkable composure. "Good Christian people, I have not come here to preach a sermon. I have come here to die. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Even at the end, Anne played the political game, perhaps thinking of her daughter Elizabeth's future in the hands of her executioner husband. She removed her headdress and tucked her dark hair into a cap. "I have a little neck," she reportedly joked to the executioner, displaying gallows humor that even modern comedians might envy. She knelt upright, repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman, perhaps in a final act of mercy, had hidden his sword to catch her unaware. He called for his assistant to bring it, causing Anne to turn slightly. In that moment, the blade fell, The queen who had captivated a king was gone in an instant. Henry, who had once written Anne passionate love letters, didn't attend the execution. Instead, he waited at Wolf Hall, home of the Seymours, dressed in white for the hunt. When the signal cannon fired announcing Anne's death, he reportedly smiled and said, "The deed is done. Unleash the dogs." Tudor romance had a definitive endpoint. The next day, yes, literally the very next day, Henry became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. They married 10 days later on May 30, 1536. Even the most impatient modern couples typically wait longer after dispatching a spouse before remarrying. If you listen carefully in the tower at night, some say you can still hear Anne's footsteps. Perhaps she walks eternally, seeking justice or simply wondering how 7 years of pursuit could end in 24 hours of blade-sharp finality. Sleep now, with the comfort of knowing your relationship disagreements won't end with a French swordsman. Anne's story reminds us that the more things change, the more breakups remain painfully consistent, though thankfully less fatal in our time. Drift with me now into the gentler presence of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, who must have possessed nerves of Tudor steel beneath her modest exterior. Imagine entering a marriage with a man whose previous wife's head had barely cooled on the executioner's block. Modern relationship baggage pales in comparison. Jane moves through Hampton Court Palace like a whisper, her footsteps barely disturbing the rushes on the floor. Unlike her vivacious, dark-haired predecessor, Jane was fair, pale, and notably quiet. Where Anne dazzled with wit and fierce intelligence, Jane soothed with gentle compliance and traditional values. Henry, having tried the exciting sports car of wives, was now test driving the reliable family carriage. Born around 1508 to a respectable gentry family, Jane had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as lady-in-waiting before catching Henry's wandering eye. You might picture her in modest gowns of silver and pale blue, her features pleasant rather than striking, her manner so demure that ambassadors sometimes struggled to describe her beyond virtuous and gentle. In a court that had grown accustomed to Anne's dramatic flair, Jane's quietness felt revolutionary. Finally, Henry might have thought, a wife who won't argue with me. The king, who had demolished the Catholic Church in England to marry his second wife, now embraced the conservative faction that had always opposed Anne. Jane's family connections to the old nobility made her a politically convenient choice as well as a personally restful one. But don't mistake Jane's quietness for weakness. When Henry presented her with a purse of money and a letter after their engagement, she returned them unopened, kneeling before him and saying, "I pray, Your Highness, if it please you to send me anything, let it be when God has made me worthy to be an honest woman." Anne had withheld her body to become queen. Jane withheld even small tokens to establish her virtue. The strategy worked splendidly both times. Their wedding on May 30, 1536, was a subdued affair by royal standards just 4 months after Anne's miscarriage and a mere 11 days after her execution. As you hover unseen among the wedding guests, you might notice sideways glances and whispered commentary about the hasty nuptials. Jane's wedding motto, "Bound to obey and serve," contrasted sharply with Anne's defiant, "the most happy." Tudor wedding planners understood theme consistency. Jane's brief reign as queen unfolded like a soothing lullaby after Anne's operatic drama. She made no waves politically, advocated for Princess Mary's reconciliation with her father, and focused on the one task that had eluded her predecessors, producing a male heir. Her household ran with quiet efficiency. Even her ladies' dresses became more modest under her influence. The court that had sparkled with French fashions and religious debate now hummed with traditional English customs and careful conformity. In early 1537, the news spread throughout the kingdom that the queen was with child. Henry, twice disappointed by pregnancies that produced daughters or ended in miscarriage, must have held his breath alongside the rest of England. Jane's pregnancy progressed without incident through the spring and summer of 1537. Her cravings for apples from the Wolf Hall orchards were indulged. The best midwives in the kingdom stood ready to attend her. In September, Jane retired to Hampton Court Palace for her lying-in period. The birthing chamber was prepared according to ancient custom. Windows sealed, tapestries hung to keep out drafts, a large bed prepared with the finest linens. Jane would spend the final weeks of her pregnancy in this dim, close room, attended only by women, as Tudor medical practices dictated. Comfort was a relative concept in 16th century obstetrics. On October 12, 1537, after a grueling 3-day labor, Jane delivered what everyone had been waiting for, a healthy male child. "You have a prince, conceived in lawful matrimony," the delighted messengers informed Henry. The little boy was named Edward, and bonfires blazed across London in celebration. The Tudor dynasty finally had its spare to accompany the heir. Jane, exhausted but triumphant, received visits from relieved courtiers. Even Henry, breaking with tradition, visited her birthing chamber. The christening on October 15 was a splendid affair, with little Edward carried by the king's eldest daughter Mary, a symbolic reconciliation orchestrated by Jane. But as you drift alongside Jane in her dimly lit chamber, you might notice her complexion growing paler, her forehead warmer to the touch. The queen who had delivered England's prince developed childbed fever, as so many Tudor women did. By October 16, concerns for her health had become serious. Henry ordered special prayers throughout the kingdom. For 12 days, Jane lingered between life and death, her body racked with fever and pain. The birthing chamber, designed to welcome new life, became instead a sick room thick with the scent of medicinal herbs and the murmured prayers of attendants. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour died, likely from puerperal sepsis and infection that modern antibiotics would have easily cured. Henry, who had disposed of wives with bureaucratic efficiency, found himself genuinely grief-stricken. Here lies Jane, a phoenix who died in giving another phoenix birth. He would later have inscribed on her tomb. The king wore black for 3 months and retreated into seclusion, an unusual display of mourning for a man not known for sentimental attachment. Jane achieved what neither Catherine nor Anne could. She gave Henry his son, died before he could tire of her, and thus remained eternally his true wife in his memory. When Henry commissioned his own tomb years later, he requested to be buried beside Janetha, only one of his 6 wives to receive this honor. Death, it seems, was the most secure position in Tudor matrimony. She was queen for only 17 months, the shortest reign of Henry's wives, but arguably the most successful by Tudor standards. Jane never had time to make political enemies, never challenged Henry's authority, and produced the all-important male heir. Her family's fortunes rose with her marriage and survived her death. Her brothers Edward and Thomas Seymour would play significant roles during her son's eventual reign. As we leave Jane Seymour's story, you might imagine her gentle presence at Hampton Court Palace, where her ghost is said to appear on the anniversary of Edward's birth, climbing the Silverstick stairs with a candle to visit the room where her son was born. Even in death, the quiet queen remains focused on her greatest achievement, giving England its prince. Sleep now, with the comforting knowledge that modern medicine makes childbirth vastly safer than in Jane's time. And perhaps spare a kindly thought for the woman who, in giving life, lost her own, but secured her place as the only wife Henry genuinely seemed to mourn. Are you settled comfortably? Good, because after Jane Seymour's death, our Tudor tale takes a peculiar turn, veering into what might be history's most awkward blind date scenario. Imagine swiping right on a flattering profile picture, only to discover your match looks nothing like their photo, except the stakes are a royal marriage and international relations. For more than 2 years after Jane's death, Henry remained unmarried, his longest period of bachelorhood since his first wedding. Though genuinely grieving Jane, he was also a practical king who needed a diplomatic alliance and, ideally, more sons to secure the Tudor line. By 1539, Thomas Cromwell, ever the efficient royal matchmaker, had fixed his sights on a Protestant-German alliance through marriage to Anne of Cleves. Anne, born in 1515 to the Duke of Cleves, had been raised in the conservative court of Dusseldorf. You might picture her moving through the Cleves castle, modestly dressed in heavy German styles, taught to run a noble household, but with limited education in music, literature, or languages. She spoke no English and had never left her homeland. Diplomatic marriages rarely prioritized personal compatibility. Henry, now 48 and considerably less athletic than in his youth, demanded to see what his potential bride looked like before committing. Enter Hans Holbein the Younger, court painter extraordinaire, dispatched to Cleves to capture Anne's likeness. The resulting portrait showed a pleasant, dignified young woman with fair features and an elaborate headdress. Henry, perhaps projecting his desires onto the painted image, declared himself pleased. The marriage treaty was signed in October 1539, and Anne made the long winter journey to England, arriving at Dover on December 27. Henry, in a gesture combining romantic impetuosity with royal impatience, decided to surprise his bride-to-be at Rochester, where she was resting before her formal entry into London. He arrived on New Year's Day 1540, disguised, though how effectively a notably corpulent king with a recognizable limp could disguise himself remains questionable. Imagine yourself hovering invisibly in that Rochester chamber as Henry burst in, expecting his bride to recognize him despite his disguise and fall romantically into his arms. Anne, understandably startled by a large unknown man invading her room, showed no recognition and little interest in this peculiar English custom of surprise visits. The king's romantic gesture collapsed into awkwardness faster than an undercooked Tudor pastry. Henry retreated, furious and humiliated. "I like her not," he declared to anyone who would listen. He complained that Anne looked nothing like her portrait, dubbing her the Flanders mare, though this particular insult may be a later invention. Tudor disappointment rarely remained private, especially royal disappointment. Despite his personal distaste, international politics demanded the marriage proceed. Anne and Henry were wed on January 6, 1540, at Greenwich Palace. You can almost feel the chill in the air, and not just from the January weather. "If it were not to satisfy the world and my realm," Henry confided to Cromwell, "I would not do what I must do this day for any earthly thing." Hardly the romantic declaration every bride hopes to hear. The wedding night proved equally disappointing, at least according to Henry's subsequent claims. "I liked her before, not well, but now I like her much worse," he reportedly said the next morning. He complained of her body odor, her sagging breasts, and other ungallant observations that Tudor chroniclers dutifully recorded. Anne, raised conservatively and speaking no English, was likely bewildered by her new husband's evident displeasure. As you drift through the cold corridors of Whitehall Palace that winter, you might notice how Henry avoided his new queen whenever possible. The court that should have been celebrating a royal marriage instead whispered about the king's growing interest in young Catherine Howard, a petite, vivacious lady-in-waiting, who stood in stark contrast to the modest, reserved Anne. Thomas Cromwell, who had championed the Cleves alliance, found his political position deteriorating alongside the royal marriage he had arranged. The conservative faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine Howard's uncle, seized the opportunity to undermine the chief minister. By June 1540, Cromwell had been arrested on charges of treason and heresy Tudor politics, showing its teeth once again. As spring warmed to summer, Henry's lawyers worked feverishly to find grounds for ending the marriage. Their solution proved both creative and convenient. Anne's previous engagement to Francis, Duke of Lorraine, though formally dissolved years earlier, was deemed a pre-contract that invalidated her marriage to Henry. The legal contortions would have impressed even modern divorce attorneys. Here's where Anne of Cleves showed wisdom that her predecessors might have envied. Rather than fighting the annulment like Catherine of Aragon, or falling victim to manufactured charges like Anne Boleyn, she cooperated fully. On July 9th, 1540, she wrote to Henry accepting the annulment, acknowledging him as her brother, and surrendering her wedding ring. Tudor survival instincts at their finest. Henry, impressed by her compliance, rewarded Anne generously. She received Richmond Palace, Hever Castle, ironically the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and a substantial income that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. She was officially designated the king's beloved sister, with precedence over all ladies in England except the Queen and the king's daughters. As divorce settlements go, it set a standard few could match. Anne settled comfortably into English life, learning the language, adopting English fashions, and occasionally visiting court where, surprisingly, she developed cordial relationships with Henry's children, particularly Elizabeth, who would have remembered little of her own mother. Anne outlived Henry and all his other wives, dying in 1557 during Mary's reign, having never returned to Cleves. The day after his marriage to Anne was annulled, Henry married Catherine Howard. Thomas Cromwell lost his head on July 28, 1540, the same day as the king's fifth wedding Tudor efficiency at scheduling both executions and nuptials. As you drift towards sleep, think of Anne of Cleves in her comfortable English manner, perhaps enjoying a game of cards or practicing her English, having traded 6 months of an uncomfortable marriage for decades of wealthy independence. Of all Henry's wives, she may have negotiated the best outcome, keeping her head and her fortune while watching the Tudor drama unfold from a safe distance. Rest well, knowing that unlike Tudor times, modern relationships rarely begin with diplomatic negotiations and misleading portraits. Though perhaps the parallel to dating app profile pictures isn't entirely obsolete. Some aspects of human nature remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. Are you still awake? Good, because our next wife makes the others seem positively ancient by comparison. Imagine being 16 or 17 years old, yes. Historians still debate her exact age, and catching the eye of a king nearly 3 decades your senior. Modern dating apps have age filters for precisely this sort of situation. Catherine Howard glides through the Tudor court like a butterfly, all vibrant colors and delicate movements. Unlike her predecessors, she brings neither impressive education nor political connections, just youth, beauty, and a dangerous naivety about court politics. The scent of her perfume lingers in the air, lighter and sweeter than the heavy rosewater favored by older ladies, her laughter echoing down corridors where Anne Boleyn once walked. Yes, Anne was her cousin. The Howard family apparently hadn't learned from that particular family tragedy. Born around 1523 to an impoverished branch of the powerful Howard clan, Catherine's early education was remarkably neglected. While Catherine of Aragon studied Latin and Anne Boleyn debated theology, young Catherine Howard learned to dance prettily and make pleasant conversation. Her formative years were spent in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision proved as scarce as scholarly texts. As you drift alongside teenage Catherine in the Dowager Duchess's manor, you might notice how easily she slips from her dormitory at night, giggling with other young ladies as they entertain music teachers and young gentlemen in their room. 2 men in particular, Henry Manox, her music teacher, and Francis Derham, a secretary engaged in what Tudor law would consider pre-contract relationships with Catherine. In modern terms, she had sexual relationships with both before ever meeting Henry. In Tudor terms, this was a future catastrophe wrapped in silk ribbons. By 1539, Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, saw an opportunity in his pretty, vivacious niece. Anne of Cleves was clearly failing to capture Henry's interest, while Catherine had caught the aging king's wandering eye. The Howard family, having lost influence after Anne Boleyn's fall, staged a remarkable comeback by presenting Catherine as everything Anne of Cleves was not: young, flirtatious, and thoroughly English in her manners. Marriage came swiftly after Henry's annulment from Anne of Cleves. On July 28, 1540, the same day Thomas Cromwell lost his head on Tower Hill, Catherine Howard became Henry's 5th wife. "No rose without a thorn," Henry reportedly declared, bestowing upon Catherine the ironic nickname, "My Rose Without a Thorn." Tudor pet names rarely age well. The king, who had once been the most eligible bachelor in Europe, was now 50, chronically ill with an ulcerated leg and substantially overweight. Yet with Catherine, he experienced a second youth, showering his child bride with jewels, gowns, and public displays of affection that made courtiers hide their discomfort behind ornate fans. "The king's in such joy," the French ambassador reported, "that I know not whether he is more in love with the queen's fair body or her pleasant behavior." Tudor diplomats had a gift for uncomfortable observations. As you follow Catherine through her brief queenship, you might notice her growing confidence as she presides over banquets and dances. The girl who had never been taught statecraft was learning on the job, though her interests remained firmly fixed on courtly entertainments rather than politics. Her household included stepdaughter Mary, 5 years her senior, creating what must have been awkward family dinners rivaling any modern blended family gathering. But Catherine's past refused to remain buried. In her household, she appointed Francis Deramis, that Francis Dereham, former Lovera's, her personal secretary. Whether this was naivety or bravado remains debated. More dangerously, she began an actual affair with Thomas Culpeper, a handsome gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Their clandestine meetings were facilitated by Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, who had testified against her own husband during Anne's fall. Tudor court drama had more recurring characters than a daytime soap opera. By November 1541, rumors of Catherine's past indiscretions reached Archbishop Cranmer. The evidence was damning. Testimony from former roommates, love letters in Catherine's own hand to Culpeper, "I never longed so much for thing as I do to see you," and Deram's own confession under torture. Tudor investigations rarely bothered with things like Miranda rights. Cranmer, perhaps remembering Anne Boleyn's fate, placed the evidence in letter form and slipped it to Henry during church services. The king, who had proclaimed undying love for his rose without a thorn, initially refused to believe the accusations. He demanded an investigation, perhaps hoping for evidence of his wife's innocence. He didn't get it. As November frost etched patterns on palace windows, Catherine's world collapsed with brutal swiftness. Confined to her apartments, she reportedly broke free and ran screaming through Hampton Court Palace's galleries, trying to reach Henry during chapel to plead for mercy. Guards caught her before she reached the king. Those same galleries are said to be haunted by her ghost still, her desperate cries echoing through the centuries. Culpeper and Dereham faced the traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, though Culpeper's sentence was commuted to simple beheading as a mercy reflecting his higher status. Tudor justice maintained strict class distinctions, even in execution methods. Catherine, stripped of her royal title, awaited her fate at Sion Abbey before being transferred to the Tower of London on February 10, 1542. The night before her execution, tradition holds that she requested the block be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it. A macabre rehearsal for the 19-year-old who had never been prepared for either her rise or her fall. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard walked to the same scaffold where her cousin Anne had died 6 years earlier. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," she allegedly declared. though this statement more likely reflects Tudor gossip than historical fact. Her actual last words were a prayer for mercy for her soul and for the king. The axe fell, and Henry's fifth marriage ended as abruptly as it had begun. The rose had revealed her thorns, but it was Henry who had been pricked most deeply. He retreated into depression after Catherine's death, aging noticeably. The king, who had executed two wives, now adopted black as his signature color, perhaps finally recognizing the darkness of his own marital history. Rest now, and be thankful that modern relationship indiscretions rarely end with a trip to the Tower. Tudor dating disasters had finality that even the most dramatic modern breakup can't match. And Catherine's story reminds us that youth and beauty, without wisdom to guide them, are dangerous gifts indeed when paired with a crown. Let's draw the bed curtains closer as we meet Henry's sixth and final wife, the woman who managed what seemed increasingly impossible. She survived him. Catherine Parr glides into our story like a cool breeze after a storm, her sensible footsteps echoing through palace corridors, still haunted by the ghosts of wives past. Are you comfortable? Good, because unlike her predecessors, Catherine Parr might actually want you to be. By 1543, as Henry limped into his 50s, ulcerated leg oozing and temper flaring, the position of Queen of England had developed an unfortunate reputation. 2 beheadings, 1 death in childbirth, and 1 hasty annulment had made even the most ambitious court ladies reconsider the appeal of the Queen's crown. Catherine Parr, a well-educated widow of 31, had her sights set on a much safer prospect: Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane. Fate and Henry, however, had other plans. Born around 1512 to a family with court connections, Catherine received an education unusual for Tudor women, becoming fluent in French, Latin, and Italian. By the time Henry noticed her, she had already buried 2 elderly husbands, earning valuable experience in nursing cranky men through illness, a skill set about to become extremely relevant to her future. You might picture her moving efficiently through royal apartments, her keys jangling at her waist, her gown practical yet elegant, her expression pleasant but guarded. The king, who had once pursued the elusive Anne Boleyn, now set his diminished sights on a woman who showed more interest in theological debates than in him. When Henry proposed, historical records suggest he simply announced his intention to marry her. Catherine reportedly replied, "It were better to be your mistress than your wife." Tudor women were learning pattern recognition. Nevertheless, duty prevailed over personal preference, and on July 12, 1543, Catherine became Henry's 6th wife in a small ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. Thomas Seymour, her preferred suitor, was conveniently sent on a diplomatic mission abroad. Tudor matchmaking frequently involves strategic deployments. Catherine stepped into a complicated family situation that would challenge even modern blended family therapists. At 31, she became stepmother to 3 children: Mary, 27 and stubbornly Catholic; Elizabeth, 9 and precociously brilliant; and Edward, 5 and heir to the throne. The new queen navigated these relationships with remarkable skill, earning Elizabeth's lasting admiration and providing the motherless children with a stable intellectual household. The girl who would become England's greatest queen later modeled her own education and leadership style, partly on Catherine's example. While previous wives had focused on producing heirs or avoiding Henry's displeasure, Catherine pursued scholarly interests and religious reform. In 1545, she published Prayers or Meditations, becoming the first English queen to publish under her own name. As you drift through her private chambers, you might glimpse her writing late into the night, candles burning low as she carefully crafts arguments marrying faith with humanist learning. Henry, increasingly immobilized by his failing health, initially appreciated her intellectual companionship and nursing care. But Catherine's religious interests eventually threatened her security. By 1546, the conservative faction at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, had grown alarmed by the Queen's reformist tendencies. They worked to convince Henry that Catherine's theological discussions constituted heresy. The king, pain-riddled and suspicious in his final years, authorized a warrant for Catherine's arrest document that was accidentally dropped and brought to the Queen's attention. Tudor security protocols had significant room for improvement. Forewarned, Catherine staged what must rank among history's greatest marital damage control operations. She immediately went to Henry, professing that her religious discussions were merely attempts to distract him from his physical discomfort, and that she, a mere woman, relied entirely on his superior wisdom in all matters. "Is it so, sweetheart?" Henry reportedly replied, "and not, as some have reported, to instruct us?" The reconciliation was so complete that when Gardiner arrived the next day to arrest the Queen, Henry sent him away with a blistering rebuke. Tudor marriage counseling had unusually high stakes. As 1546 drew to a close, Henry's health deteriorated rapidly. Catherine nursed him with devoted care, managing his increasingly erratic moods and painful treatments. On January 28, 1547, the king who had dominated England for nearly 4 decades, redefining both church and state while cycling through 6 marriages, finally died. His final words, reportedly, were to call for Archbishop Cranmer, who arrived too late to do more than hold the king's hand as he slipped away. Catherine, who had survived the dangerous game of being Henry's wife, was now the Dowager Queen of England. But our widow's tale doesn't end with Henry's death. Within months, scandalously quickly by Tudor standards, Catherine married her original choice, Thomas Seymour, without seeking the approval of the new king's council. The couple established a household that included the young Elizabeth, creating an uncomfortably charged situation when Seymour began making inappropriate early morning visits to the princess's bedchamber. Tudor boundaries apparently required more explicit definition. In 1548, Catherine announced her pregnancy, her first, despite 3 marriages. As she prepared for childbirth, you might picture her in a cheerful chamber at Sudeley Castle, finally married to a man of her choosing, finally expecting a child of her own. On August 30, 1548, she delivered a healthy daughter, Mary. But like Jane Seymour before her, Catherine developed puerperal fever. She died on September 5, just 5 days after childbirth. Thomas Seymour would be executed for treason within months, and their orphaned daughter disappeared from historical records, presumably dying in childhood. Catherine Parr, the wife who survived Henry, couldn't survive the dangers of Tudor childbirth. She was buried at Sudeley Castle Chapel, the only one of Henry's wives to be interred as a queen, but not alongside her royal husband. In 1782, her remarkably well-preserved body was discovered by workmen, her features still recognizable after more than 2 centuries of final testament to her enduring presence. As you drift towards sleep, think of Catherine Parr's quiet strength, intellectual depth, and the maternal kindness she showed to children not her own. In a court defined by ambition and betrayal, she managed to be genuinely good, perhaps the most revolutionary act possible in Henry's England. 6 weddings and 2 funerals comfortable. Good, because tonight we'll step back to observe the pattern woven by Henry's 6 marriages, a tapestry of ambition, theology, fertility, and fate. The candlelight flickers across your drowsy eyes as we consider what these 6 women shared beyond their troublesome husband. First, the statistics for those keeping score. 2 wives beheaded on questionable charges. 1 died shortly after childbirth. 1 outlived Henry but died soon after. 1 amicably divorced or annulled in Tudor speak. And 1 discarded but survived to a respectable old age. The survival rate for Tudor queens was only marginally better than for Tudor explorers. All 6 arrived at marriage with Henry under different circumstances, but with common hopes to secure their families' positions, to bear royal children, preferably male, and to wield the subtle influence queens traditionally enjoyed. Yet each found herself navigating an increasingly unpredictable relationship with a man whose power grew more absolute as his temperament grew less stable. Catherine of Aragon brought Spanish dignity and diplomatic connections, believing until her death that she was Henry's only true wife. Anne Boleyn brought French sophistication and religious reformation, sparking the break with Rome that changed England forever. Jane Seymour brought the male heir Henry desperately sought, securing the Tudor succession at the cost of her own life. Anne of Cleves brought the potential for German-Protestant alliance, then gracefully pivoted to comfortable retirement when marriage proved uncomfortable. Catherine Howard brought youth and vitality to an aging king, but lacked the political acumen to survive court intrigue. Catherine Parr brought intellectual companionship and maternal care, guiding not only Henry but his children toward a post-Henry future. As you drift between wakefulness and dreams, consider how these 6 women, often portrayed as victim-shaped English history through their marriages. Without Catherine of Aragon's stubborn refusal to accept divorce, Henry might never have broken with Rome. Without Anne Boleyn's ambition and religious leanings, the English Reformation might have taken a different course. Without Jane Seymour's son, Mary Tudor might have maintained Catholic England after Henry's death. Each queen, in her way, redirected the river of history. The wives also shared the dubious privilege of Henry's public devotion, at least initially. The king who wrote love sonnets to Anne Boleyn for to be your servant, heart and mind, and danced night after night with Catherine Howard, was the same man who signed their death warrants. The monarch who defended Catherine of Aragon against early critics later exiled her from court and separated her from their daughter. Tudor romance had the shelf life of unrefrigerated milk. All 6 wives navigated a court where whispers could kill as surely as poison. Anne Boleyn rose through faction only to fall by it. Catherine Howard's past indiscretions reached the king through carefully planned information channels. Catherine Parr narrowly escaped arrest through quick thinking and strategic humility. The Tower of London stood as a constant reminder that royal favor was as secure as a sand castle at high tide. Yet these women were not merely Henry's victims or conquests. Catherine of Aragon managed her husband's kingdom as regent when he campaigned in France. Anne Boleyn influenced church appointments and diplomatic policy. Catherine Parr published theological works and shaped the education of future monarchs. Even Catherine Howard, often portrayed as a frivolous girl, successfully interceded for political prisoners during her brief queenship. Tudor queens found power in the margins of their prescribed roles. What bound them together, beyond their marital connection to Henry, was their navigation of impossible expectations. Tudor queens needed to be fertile but chaste, influential but submissive, educated but deferential, pious but agreeable to Henry's ever-changing religious positions. The contradictions would have challenged even the most politically astute women of any era. As Henry aged from the handsome young king who married Catherine of Aragon to the obese, ulcerated tyrant who terrified Catherine Parr, his wives adapted their strategies accordingly. The man all six married changed dramatically over 4 decades, his personality warping under the pressure of absolute power and physical suffering. The wives who survived longest, Catherine of Aragon through sheer conviction, Anne of Cleves through pragmatic acceptance, and Catherine Parr through intelligent adaptation, recognized that managing Henry was as much about managing his perception of himself as about their own behavior. Sleep now, with the knowledge that Henry's marriages, for all their drama and tragedy, produced 3 of England's most significant monarchs: Edward VI, whose brief reign accelerated Protestant reforms; Mary I, whose Catholic counter-reforms earned her the nickname Bloody Mary; and Elizabeth I, who would define an age through her deliberate choice to marry her country, rather than risk any man having power over her. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Henry's wives was a daughter who observed their fates and chose to rule alone. Sink deeper into your pillow as we explore the grand stages where our matrimonial drama unfolded. Tudor palaces magnificent, drafty, opulent, and occasionally lethal sheltered royal romance and royal executions alike. Are your eyelids growing heavy? Perfect. Or palace dreams await. Hampton Court Palace rises in your imagination, its red Tudor brick warming in morning sunlight. Originally built by Cardinal Wolsey, who gifted it to Henry in a transparent attempt to maintain royal favorites, Great Hall soars overhead, hammer beam ceiling adorned with carved antelopes and gilded roses. Here Anne Boleyn danced at her first Christmas as queen. Here Catherine Howard ran screaming through galleries seeking mercy. Here Catherine Parr nursed Henry through his final illnesses. If walls could speak, these would whisper secrets that would make even modern tabloids blush. The scent of roasting meat drifts from kitchens capable of feeding 600 courtiers daily. The sound of fountains splashing in courtyard gardens mingles with servants' footsteps on worn stone stairs. In the Queen's apartments, ladies-in-waiting embroider by windows, their needles flashing in sunlight, their conversation carefully guarded in a court where careless words could lead to tower cells. Tudor palace life combined luxury and danger in equal measure. Whitehall Palace, now mostly lost to time and fire, once sprawled over 23 acres along the Thames, making the White House look like a modest cottage by comparison. Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony in its York Place chapel. Later, he wed Catherine Parr in the Queen's closet there. The palace contained over 1,500 rooms, its corridors perfect for clandestine meetings and political whispers. Catherine Howard's fateful assignations with Thomas Culpeper occurred in these very passageways, where torch shadows could hide midnight rendezvous. Greenwich Palace, Henry's birthplace, welcomed Catherine of Aragon when she first arrived in England to marry Prince Arthur. Years later, Anne of Cleves suffered through her wedding ceremony to Henry there, likely wishing she could board the next ship back to Cleves. Elizabeth I was born within its walls, though the palace that witnessed these Tudor milestones now exists only in paintings and archaeological remains. Time has been as unkind to some Tudor buildings as Henry was to his wives. But no location looms larger in our wives' tale than the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn entered through the River Gate, Traitors' Gate in May 1536. Her barge passing beneath the stone arch that had welcomed so many who never left alive. Though originally built as a royal residence, by Tudor times the tower had transformed primarily into a prison and execution site. Anne spent her final days in royal apartments there, perhaps gazing from narrow windows at the green where her execution scaffold was being constructed. The tower's ravens hop across damp cobblestones as you drift through its courtyards in your imagination. Legend claims England will fall if the ravens ever leave the Tawara superstition that would have seemed fitting to the Tudor mind, where omens and portents carried significant weight. Catherine Howard was brought here to await execution, her youth and terror palpable in the chill February air of 1542. Stone walls that had witnessed centuries of intrigue absorbed her sobs as easily as they had Anne's prayers. Nonsuch Palace, built by Henry after Jane Seymour's death, was designed to outshine any European royal residence in its name. None such existed anywhere else. Italian Renaissance ornaments covered its facades, while elaborate gardens stretched into carefully managed wilderness. Here, an aging Henry could pretend he remained as magnificent as his architecture, though his expanding waistline and festering legs suggested otherwise. Of all Henry's palaces, Nonsuch perhaps best captured his character. Extravagant, imposing, impossible to ignore, and ultimately impermanent. Like the king himself, it has vanished entirely, leaving only descriptions and foundations buried beneath English soil. Tudor palaces featured elaborate garderobe-serly toilets that emptied directly into moats or rivers below. Privacy screens hid royal users, though the sound effects remained unmistakable. Even monarchs couldn't escape certain biological necessities, despite their divine right pretensions. Perhaps Henry contemplated his marital decisions during these private moments, seated above rushing water that carried waste toward the sea. Tudor plumbing, metaphorically appropriate for Tudor marriages. Royal beds dominated their chambers, massive oak four-posters draped with embroidered hangings and topped with feather mattresses. These weren't merely places for sleep or royal reproduction. They served as status symbols in semi-public spaces where monarchs might receive morning visitors while still abed. 6 queens laid their heads on Henry's pillows, though only 3 Catherine of Aragon, Jane Seymour, and Catherine Parr shared his bed, until natural causes parted them. The others found their royal sleeping arrangements prematurely terminated by politics, annulment, or the executioner's blade. As you drift towards sleep in your own decidedly less perilous bed, imagine the contrast between Tudor royal chambers and your modern bedroom. No courtiers will burst in tomorrow morning to help you dress. No food taster will sample your breakfast to ensure it isn't poisoned. No political rivals are plotting your downfall beyond your door. Modern life, for all its complexities, offers securities that Henry's queens might have envied more than all their jewels and titles combined. Are you comfortable? Good, because tonight we're tiptoeing toward that most private aspect of Tudor royal marriages, the intimate relations between Henry and his 6 queens. The candle flickers lower as we discuss, with appropriate delicacy, the matters that occurred when royal bedchamber doors closed and courtiers withdrew. Don't blush-shaven Tudor monarchs were merely human beneath their finery. Royal marriages served political and dynastic purposes first, but physical attraction and compatibility certainly played their parts in Henry's matrimonial decisions. The young king who married Catherine of Aragon stood over 6 feet tall, athletic and handsome, with reddish gold hair and a passion for jousting, hunting, and dancing. Contemporary accounts praised his most amiable appearance and heroic bearing. By his 6th marriage, he had transformed into a man with a 54-inch waist who required mechanical devices to hoist him onto his horse. Tudor aging, rarely graceful, especially with unlimited access to venison pasties. Catherine of Aragon, 5 years Henry's senior, had spent her youth in physical beauty and health. Her many pregnancies, at least 6 recorded, possibly more, took their toll on her body. As you imagine the royal couple in their early years, picture a genuine physical attraction, even love, between the Spanish princess and English prince. Their shared bed produced multiple pregnancies, though only Princess Mary survived to adulthood. When Catherine entered menopause around 1525, Henry's eye had already begun wandering. The king, who famously declared he never defiled any other woman, except Catherine, likely had several mistresses, including Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. Tudor faithfulness operated on a generous sliding scale. With Anne Boleyn, Henry experienced perhaps his most passionate relationship. Their courtship lasted years, with Anne famously refusing to become his mistress. "Your wife I cannot be, both in respect of mine own unworthiness, and also because you have a queen already," she wrote, though clearly leaving room for negotiation. Their love letters reveal Henry's frustration, "wishing myself, especially of an evening, in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty ducky's breasts I trust shortly to kiss." Tudor Sexting, Quill Pen Edition. Once married, Anne conceived quickly, suggesting an active physical relationship. After Elizabeth's birth and subsequent miscarriages, contemporary reports claim their intimacy waned, with arguments replacing affection. Henry complained to his physician about Anne's unseemly behavior, likely referring to her sharp tongue rather than bedroom matters. By 1536, he had stopped sharing her bed entirely. His attention shifted to Jane Seymour. Gentle Jane presented a stark physical contrast to the dark-eyed, olive-skinned Anne. Fair, modest, and soft-spoken, she embodied the Tudor ideal of womanhood that Anne had challenged. Henry's attraction to Jane represented not just a change in physical preference, but an embrace of traditional femininity after Anne's intellectualism. Their marriage was brief but successfully produced Edward, suggesting compatibility in the royal bedchamber. Jane's death and childbirth left Henry genuinely grieving the only wife whose passing moved him to tears rather than relief. Anne of Cleves presented Henry with his most notorious bedroom disappointment. After viewing Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, the king anticipated an attractive German bride. Instead, he found a woman he claimed couldn't arouse his virile potency, a diplomatic way of saying he couldn't perform his marital duties. Whether Anne truly was unattractive or Henry's aging body simply failed him remains debated. The marriage was never consummated, making annulment relatively straightforward. Tudor wedding nights, occasionally awkward enough to alter international relations. With teenage Catherine Howard, Henry experienced a brief renaissance of physical passion. Despite his deteriorating health and massive weight gain, the king behaved like a besotted youth, showering my rose without a thorn with affection and jewelry. Contemporary accounts describe him fawning over Catherine at public events, his hands forever fiddling with her necklace or her hand. Privately, however, Catherine found the aging king repulsive, turning instead to the younger, more attractive Thomas Culpeper. Their clandestine meetings, facilitated by Lady Rochford, provided the physical intimacy her royal marriage lacked and ultimately led to her execution. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, entered marriage with pragmatism rather than passion. Twice widowed and in love with Thomas Seymour, she accepted Henry's proposal as a duty rather than desire. Her role became more nurse than lover as Henry's health deteriorated further. His ulcerated leg, requiring daily dressing of foul-smelling wounds, hardly enhanced marital relations. Though Catherine performed her wifely duties in all respects, their relationship seems to have evolved into companionate care rather than romantic love. Her swift remarriage after Henry's death suggests relief rather than prolonged mourning. Throughout 6 marriages, Henry's body transformed from athletic prince to bloated sovereign, while his temperament soured from charming youth to suspicious tyrant. The injuries, illnesses, and weight gain that marked his later years likely affected his romantic capabilities, perhaps explaining his increasingly short-lived marriages and mercurial temper. Modern medical theories suggest diabetes, syphilis, or genetic disorders might explain both his physical decline and erratic behavior. 6 wives experienced different versions of Henry-only Catherine Parr, knew the full transformation from magnificent monarch to malodorous invalid. As you drift toward dreams, consider how Henry's physical changes mirrored his psychological evolution. The handsome prince who danced at masques became the hulking king who required widened doorways. The romantic who penned love sonnets became the tyrant who signed death warrants. The virile youth who fathered children became the invalid, attended by physicians. Perhaps in Henry's bedchamber, we see the most human side of a king who claimed divine authority, yet remained painfully, catastrophically mortal. Your eyelids grow heavier as we explore perhaps the most crucial aspect of Tudor royal marriages, dynastic succession. Henry's desperate quest for legitimate male heirs drove his marital decisions more powerfully than any other factor. Settle back against your pillows as we trace the children born and unborn who shaped the fate of 6 queens and a kingdom. Tudor medicine understood little about conception and pregnancy. When Catherine of Aragon suffered multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths, blame fell first on divine displeasure, then on Catherine herself. Their first child, a daughter, lived only a few hours. A son, Henry, survived nearly 2 months before dying suddenly in 1511. The king held a magnificent tournament celebrating this prince's birth, only to plunge into mourning weeks later. The cradle prepared with such hope sat empty, while black-draped courtiers whispered about God's judgment. In 1516, Catherine delivered a healthy daughter, Mary the future Queen Mary I. Though Henry welcomed the child, royal fathers couldn't hide their disappointment at daughters. "By God's grace, sons will follow," he reportedly said, maintaining optimism. But sons didn't follow, and Catherine's final pregnancy in 1518 produced another stillbirth. As fertility treatments, she and Henry made pilgrimages to holy shrines, donated to churches, and consulted physicians who prescribed everything from herbal remedies to changes in bedroom positions. Tudor reproductive technology, equal parts prayer and superstition, with results to match. By 1525, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to his brother's widow violated biblical law. Leviticus 20:21 warned that such unions would be childless, which Henry creatively reinterpreted to mean without male heirs. Never mind that Catherine had borne living children. Theological convenience has always been adaptable. The king who had defended Catherine against early criticism now blamed her for their dynastic disappointments. Anne Boleyn's first pregnancy in 1533 was confident cause for celebration. Henry, certain a son approached, prepared lavish christening arrangements and tournaments to herald his long-awaited heir. When Elizabeth emerged instead, disappointment rippled through court, though official announcements maintained optimistic tones. "The princess shall be an heir," Henry declared, though clearly hoping future sons would supersede her claim. Little did he imagine this unwanted daughter would become England's most celebrated monarch. Anne's subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage, including a male fetus lost in January 1536, following Catherine of Aragon's death, and possibly triggered by Anne's discovery of Jane Seymour sitting on Henry's lap. The stress of court intrigue, constant scrutiny, and Henry's wandering attention created hardly ideal conditions for successful pregnancy. Without modern prenatal care, Tudor queens literally risked their lives with each conception. Jane Seymour succeeded where her predecessors had failed, delivering Prince Edward on October 12, 1537, after a difficult 30-hour labor. Henry's joy knew no bounds. Bonfires blazed across London, church bells rang continuously, and free wine flowed in streets. The king personally carried his son to his christening, tears streaming down his face. When Jane died 12 days later from puerperal fever, Henry's grief was genuine-ish, had fulfilled the primary royal wife duty, providing an heir while maintaining appropriate submissive behavior. The ultimate Tudor wife achievement, though one Jane couldn't live to enjoy. Anne of Cleves never conceived during her brief, unconsummated marriage. The annulment documentation delicately referenced the king's inability to consummate, suggesting Henry's reproductive problems rather than Anne's. By 1540, the king approaching 50 faced declining fertility alongside his other health issues. Though Tudor medical knowledge couldn't address male reproductive challenges, the king who had blamed Catherine of Aragon's age for their childlessness was now older than she had been when he sought annulment. Tudor reproductive double standards functioned as effectively as modern ones. Catherine Howard, despite her youth and presumed fertility, never announced a pregnancy during her brief marriage. Given Henry's deteriorating health, the absence of royal pregnancies might reflect reduced royal bedroom activities rather than Catherine's fertility. Her extramarital relationship with Thomas Culpeper never produced children either, suggesting either careful precautions or simple biological chance. Tudor contraception existed primarily as herbal remedies and coitus interruptus methods of varying reliability. Catherine Parr, who married Henry when he was 52 and she 31, likewise never conceived during their 3-year marriage. Yet after Henry's death, she quickly became pregnant by Thomas Seymour, suggesting the reproductive challenge lay with the king rather than his final queen. Her daughter, Mary Seymour, arrived in August 1548, followed by Catherine's death from childbed fever, days later the same fate that had claimed Jane Seymour 11 years earlier. Tudor childbirth remained perilous, regardless of royal status. Henry's reproductive legacy ended with 3 surviving legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each born to different mothers. All 3 would eventually rule England, creating the Tudor succession Henry had so desperately sought, though not in the straightforward father-to-son pattern he envisioned. Edward reigned briefly from 1547 to 1553, dying at 15 from tuberculosis or similar respiratory disease. Mary ruled from 1553 to 1558, attempting to restore Catholicism to England before dying childless. Elizabeth, the unwanted daughter, reigned from 1558 to 1603, her 45-year rule marking the pinnacle of Tudor achievement and the dynasty's end. As sleep beckons you deeper into its embrace, consider how Henry's obsession with male heirs ironically resulted in his greatest legacy flowing through his daughters. His son, raised Protestant, tried dismantling Catholic traditions. His elder daughter, raised Catholic, tried restoring them. But his younger daughter created the balanced Anglican compromise that defined English religious identity for centuries. The king who changed wives like seasonal wardrobes seeking sons ultimately found his dynasty's greatest achievement in Elizabeth proving that Tudor history, like bedtime stories, often delivers unexpected endings. Still awake? Good, because there's something peculiarly fascinating about what happened to Henry's wives after they ceased being wives, whether through divorce, death, or beheading. The soft glow of your bedside lamp illuminates this most macabre aspect of our Tudor tale, the afterlives, both literal and figurative, of 6 queens. Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle on January 7, 1536, isolated from court and separated from her beloved daughter Mary. Her last letter to Henry authentic, or note expressed forgiveness. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things. Upon hearing of her death, Henry and Anne Boleyn reportedly wore yellow, a color of celebration in Tudor England, though Henry ordered official court mourning. Catherine's funeral at Peterborough Cathedral lacked royal honors. She was buried not as Queen of England, but as Princess Dowager of Wales, reflecting her first marriage to Arthur. Her tomb, modest by royal standards, later became a Catholic pilgrimage site during Mary's reign. In death as in life, Catherine remained a symbol of traditional faith and stubborn dignity. Anne Boleyn's body received less reverent treatment. After her beheading on Tower Green, attendants discovered no coffin had been prepared in oversight or deliberate final insult. Her ladies wrapped her head and body in white cloth, placing them in an arrow chest repurposed as a makeshift coffin. She was buried in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, her grave unmarked until Victorian renovations. No funeral service was recorded. Henry ordered all images of Anne destroyed, her royal emblems removed from palace decorations, her initials carved into wood and stone chiseled away. Tudor cancel culture operated with literal hammers. Jane Seymour received Henry's most elaborate funerary honors. Her body lay in state with full queenly ceremony before burial in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the first English queen to be interred there. Henry commissioned a magnificent tomb for them to share, though construction delays meant only the black marble base was completed before his death. As promised, Henry was eventually buried beside Jane in 1547, the only wife to receive this honor. Her heart was reportedly buried separately in the Chapel Royale, a literal token of Henry's affection. Tudor romance occasionally continued beyond the grave, though only for wives who provided male heirs. Anne of Cleves, uniquely among Henry's wives, outlived him by 10 years, dying in 1557 during Mary's reign. Her will requested to be buried in the tomb which I had begun, suggesting she had prepared her own monument, conscious of her unique place in Tudor history. She was interred in Westminster Abbey with proper ceremony, though her tomb remains relatively modest. The woman who had navigated Tudor politics most successfully received appropriate honors in death, remembered fondly as the king's beloved sister rather than his rejected wife. Catherine Howard's execution echoed Anne Boleyn's, though with even less dignity. After beheading on February 13, 1542, her body joined Anne's in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, buried quickly without ceremony. No exact burial location was recorded. During Victorian renovations of the chapel in 1876, workers discovered numerous female remains. Impossible to identify individual, a sad metaphor for how history often treats women deemed disposable. No portrait of Catherine Howard survives with absolute certainty. Like her remains, her image was effectively erased from Tudor record. Catherine Parr, who survived Henry, chose her own burial place at Sudeley Castle Chapel after dying from childbed fever in 1548. Her funeral featured the first English Protestant burial service for a queen, reflecting the Reformed faith she had quietly championed. Her grave was lost during the English Civil War when parliamentarian forces damaged the chapel. In 1782, ladies visiting the ruins discovered her lead coffin, opening it to find Catherine's body remarkably well preserved. After 234 years, her flesh still soft, her features recognizable. Multiple reburials followed, with Victorian sentimentality finally providing a proper tomb in 1817. Even in death, Catherine Parr couldn't rest undisturbed. Beyond physical remains, Henry's wives achieved varied afterlives in cultural memory. Catherine of Aragon became a Catholic martyr, her steadfastness to Rome celebrated in counter-Reformation narratives. Anne Boleyn transformed from vilified temptress to proto-feminist heroine, her ambition reinterpreted as admirable independence. Jane Seymour remained Henry's true wife in official Tudor mythology, her short reign remembered primarily for producing Edward. Anne of Cleves became a symbol of pragmatic diplomacy, Catherine Howard a cautionary tale about youth and naivete, while Catherine Parr emerged as an overlooked intellectual and religious reformer. Modern popular culture has further reshaped these women's posthumous identities. Films, novels, television series, and even musicals have reimagined them sometimes as helpless victims, sometimes as calculating politicians, occasionally as romantic heroines. Each generation recreates Tudor queens in its own image. Victorian histories emphasize their moral virtues or failures. Feminist retellings highlight patriarchal constraints they navigated. Contemporary versions often portray them as complex women, balancing personal desires with political necessities. As your consciousness drifts toward dreams, consider how these 6 women long physically decayed within their tombs continue living through our collective imagination. Their stories endure not merely as historical footnotes, but as archetypes exploring timeless themes: loyalty versus ambition, religious conviction versus pragmatism, youth versus experience, passion versus duty. In cultural memory, Henry's wives have outlived him, their varied tragedies and occasional triumphs resonating more deeply than his increasingly tyrannical kingship. Perhaps that's the ultimate revenge. The king who tried controlling their bodies can't control their posthumous narratives. The candle burns low now as we approach our story's end. 6 wives, 6 distinct chapters in Tudor history, 6 women whose lives intertwined with England's transformation from medieval kingdom to emerging modern state. Their collective legacy extends far beyond providing Henry with heirs or satisfying his marital whims. As sleep gently tugs at your consciousness, let's consider what these queens bequeathed to history. Religious revolution stands as their most profound legacy. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to accept annulment forced Henry to break with Rome, while Anne Boleyn's reformist sympathies helped shape the early English Reformation. Catherine Parr's quiet but persistent Protestant influence guided the dying king and young Edward toward further reforms. Without these 3 queens and their varied religious convictions, England's spiritual landscape might have developed entirely differently. Tudor theological arguments, sparked by marital disputes, eventually created the uniquely English compromise of Anglicanism, neither fully Catholic nor radically Protestant. Constitutional development followed religious change. Henry's determination to marry Anne Boleyn led to parliamentary legislation, establishing royal supremacy over the church, a crucial step in England's long journey toward constitutional rather than absolute monarchy. The Act of Supremacy, the Treasons Act, and other legislation enacted to facilitate Henry's marriages created precedents limiting traditional powers while expanding new ones. Queens became unwitting catalysts for legal evolution that would eventually constrain the monarchy their husband had expanded. Tudor irony at its finest. Educational advancement, particularly for women, emerged gradually from these queens' examples. Catherine of Aragon, educated in Isabella of Castile's humanist court, ensured daughter Mary received classical learning unusual for Tudor girls. Anne Boleyn, influenced by reformed continental thinking, created a court that valued female intellectual accomplishment. Catherine Parr, the first English queen to publish under her own name, established a household where young Elizabeth absorbed both scholarly discipline and female authorial ambition. These educational ripples extended beyond royal children to noble families increasingly willing to educate daughters in humanist traditions. Diplomatic realignment followed marital patterns. Catherine of Aragon's Spanish connections initially secured England's alliance with her powerful Habsburg relatives. Her divorce prompted dangerous isolation from Catholic Europe. Anne of Cleves represented a failed attempt at Protestant-German alliance. Each queen brought potential international relationships that shaped English foreign policy, sometimes for generations. Royal marriages functioned as living treaties, with bedroom politics directly affecting battlefield deployments. Fashion and material culture transformed under 6 different queenly influences. Catherine of Aragon brought Spanish styles of dress and devotional practices. Anne Boleyn introduced French fashions and courtly manners. Anne of Cleves briefly imported German artistic elements. Each queen commissioned portraits, buildings, textiles, and jewelry, reflecting their personal tastes and cultural backgrounds. Tudor visual culture evolved through these varied feminine influences, creating a uniquely English aesthetic blending continental styles with island traditions. Court faction dynamics, that deadly serious Tudor game, pivoted around queens and their relatives. The Howard family rose through Anne Boleyn's ascension, fell with her execution, then rose again through Catherine Howard's brief queenship. The Seymour faction gained power through Jane, lost influence after her death, then re-emerged during Edward's reign. Queens weren't merely passive chess pieces in male political games. They actively promoted family members, religious allies, and personal favorites, sometimes successfully, sometimes catastrophically. Tudor court politics functioned as family business, with queens as crucial connectors between royal power and aristocratic ambition. Most significantly, these 6 marriages produced 3 remarkable monarchs whose successive reigns defined English identity. Edward VI's brief rule accelerated Protestant reforms, establishing theological foundations that survived his early death. Mary I's attempt to restore Catholicism revealed both the impossibility of returning to pre-Reformation religion and the dangers of religious persecution lessons that shaped her sister's more moderate approach. Elizabeth I, inheriting traits from both parents Henry's strategic instinct and Anne's intellectual agility, created the pragmatic religious settlement and cultural flowering that defined England's golden age. 3 children of 3 different queens collectively transformed England from second-tier kingdom to emerging imperial power. Beyond these tangible legacies lies something more elusive. These 6 women humanized history through their varied responses to similar pressures. Catherine of Aragon chose dignified resistance, Anne Boleyn, ambitious adaptation, Jane Seymour, strategic compliance, Anne of Cleves, pragmatic acceptance, Catherine Howard youthful recklessness, and Catherine Parr intellectual engagement. Their diverse approaches to navigating Henry's dangerous affections remind us that historical figures faced genuine choices within their constraints, just as we do within ours. As sleep claims you completely, carry this final thought into your dreams. Beyond politics, religion, or dynasty, these 6 queens left us the most human legacy of all 6 different answers to the eternal question of how individuals maintain dignity and purpose when caught in circumstances beyond their control. Their varied responses, spanning from defiance to adaptation, offer timeless lessons more valuable than any crown jewels. You've journeyed with us now through 6 marriages, 2 beheadings, 1 death in childbirth, and more drama than a modern reality show could ever hope to capture. And here you are, still awake though, perhaps, just barely having survived more Tudor intrigue than many courtiers did. Quite the accomplishment for someone wearing pajamas rather than ermine-trimmed robes. The soft glow of history's candlelight reveals a curious truth as we prepare to leave these royal bedchambers behind. 6 women, each drawn into the orbit of one tempestuous king, each leaving her own indelible mark on history. Perhaps the most remarkable thing isn't Henry's appetite for matrimony, but how each queen, in her own way, shaped a nation even as she struggled within the gilded cage of Tudor queenship. Catherine of Aragon, with her dignified defiance, Anne Boleyn, with her revolutionary impact, Jane Seymour, with her brief triumph of tradition, Anne of Cleves, with her pragmatic self-preservation, young Catherine Howard, with her tragic naivety, and Catherine Parr, with her steady wisdom. They weren't merely wives. They were women navigating the most dangerous political waters imaginable, with only their wits and will to guide them. Isn't it wonderfully ironic that the man who desperately sought a male heir to secure his legacy ultimately found it most powerfully preserved through his daughters? Elizabeth I, daughter of the wife he beheaded, would become perhaps England's greatest monarch. Mary I, daughter of the wife he cast aside, would become its most controversial. History has a delicious sense of poetic justice, doesn't it? As you drift towards sleep beneath your comfortably modern blanket sands, bedbugs, and political intrigue, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that even the most powerful men cannot control how history remembers them. Henry sought to be remembered as a mighty king, a second Arthur, a Renaissance prince. Instead, he's immortalized through the stories of the women he married, discarded, and occasionally destroyed. The palaces are quiet now. Hampton Court's corridors no longer echo with the heavy footsteps of an aging king or the whispered plots of ambitious courtiers. The tower's stones no longer witness the final prayers of queens condemned. All that remains are stories, like the one I've whispered to you through these quiet hours. Thank you for allowing me to be your guide through this tumultuous chapter of history, for letting me lead you through throne rooms and bedchambers, through coronations and executions, through the intimate moments of 6 remarkable women whose lives became extraordinary through circumstances they never could have imagined. Remember, as sleep finally claims you, that you possess luxuries. These queens never knew the freedom to choose your own path, to speak your mind without fear of a king's displeasure, to rest your head on your pillow, knowing it will almost certainly remain attached to your shoulders come morning. These are not small blessings. And so our Tudor tale comes to its close. The candles guttering in their holders, the fire reduced to embers, the night deepening around us. May your dreams be sweeter than Catherine Howard's were in her final days. May your morning be brighter than Anne Boleyn's last sunrise. And may you wake refreshed in a world where, thankfully, Henry VIII isn't choosing your breakfast, let alone your spouse. Sleep well, gentle listener. History will still be there in the morning, but for now, like 6 queens before you, you've earned your rest.